The family of Otto Warmbier has sued the DPRK, wanting $1 billion in damages for the detention and alleged torturing of their son. As you recall, Otto Warmbier is the young man from the United States who went to the DPRK in 2016 and stole a propaganda poster, something that he had intended to take home as a trophy to his religious family and his church. In other words, he had intended it as a sign of disrespect. Now, he was caught and he was sentenced to 15 years of hard labor for essentially insulting the country. Now, eventually, along the way, something happened to Otto Warmbier, and he was released on humanitarian grounds. He died a few days after having returned to the United States. Now, his family alleges that he was tortured while he was in the DPRK. They said when they first saw their son, he was jerking violently and making inhuman sounds. They said that his arms and legs were totally deformed. He had a scar on his foot that had been an open wound for some time, and his bottom teeth looked like, and I quote, like someone had taken a pair of pliers to them. Now, the problem with this claim is that a medical examiner says that there was no obvious signs of torture. And in fact, his teeth were perfectly fine. The family has lied about the torture of their son for political purposes, and that the ongoing hostility between the United States and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. More than one medical examiner has testified that there was in fact no torture whatsoever. However, despite that, a U.S. court has decided that the DPRK owes them $500 million for the torture of their son and pain and distress the family suffered. Of course, this ruling is absolutely laughable in the face of the facts that have come out. These were U.S. doctors. These were not people from the DPRK with medical experience. This was the U.S.'s own doctor saying that there was no signs of torture at all, and that his teeth were perfectly fine. His family completely fabricated the story, which was then carried by the U.S. State Department in order to demonize the DPRK for the American public and to justify further hostile foreign policy towards the country. Now, I did report previously that I believe Otto had attempted suicide. Now, he did come back from what was called botulism, and he was essentially in a coma, his brain having been denied oxygen. Now, this is really not consistent with botulism. However, it is consistent with someone who had attempted to hang themselves in a cell. Now, of course, this begs more questions. Now, the reason I believe this is that the DPRK doesn't want to admit that Otto had attempted suicide. Now, admitting so would mean that they didn't do their job, that they had done something wrong. They were not watching, somebody wasn't doing what they were supposed to be doing, and this would be a form of negligence that would make them responsible. So I do believe that when they claim he had botulism, that they lied. However, I do also know that his family would lie when it's fairly obvious in this case, given the facts, that he did attempt suicide. Now, keep in mind that he is from an extremely religious family, in this case Christian, who greatly frown upon suicide being that something that can condemn someone's soul to hell. I'm not here to criticize the religion, I'm only stating the facts with regards to the religion. However, rather than bear what they feel would be a shame on their family, I mean, that would be unfair to do to them, it's not right. So what they're doing instead is using his death for political gain. Now, I believe that it's perfectly reasonable that someone who had gone to this country, insulted it, ended up getting sentenced to 15 years hard labor. Someone who comes from a wealthy family who's clearly never worked a day in his life and has done nothing but be, frankly, from much of his behavior that we have seen before any of this happened, was pretty much an entitled little brat. And then for suddenly to be taken out of that comfortable world where someone felt that they were invincible and frankly, above the law in many cases due to the fact that their family is wealthy. To be suddenly thrown into hard labor in a foreign country, somewhere where you don't know the customs, the language, or even how the country even works, can be terribly frightening for such a person who's lived such an isolated, protected life. And that would certainly be enough of a mental stress to cause someone to resort to suicide. So I don't think it's unreasonable that he would have attempted it in this case. But what's interesting here is that the United States courts have decided that the DPRK owes $500 million for a torture that never took place. And this begs a whole ton of other questions as well. What about the people that were tortured by the United States inside of Guantanamo Bay? What about all the people in U.S. prisons that have suffered torture? Many of them for something as simple as being in possession of marijuana. The fact that the U.S. Prison system is so terrible that they even will not allow the UN to carry out inspections of U.S. prisons. How about that? Because the prison culture and general standards inside the United States are tremendously deplorable and border on outright torture. Some people being in solitary confinement for decades at a time, people being beaten mercilessly by guards for simply disagreeing with them. I mean, we've all seen the footage of this stuff leaked, and we know this goes on. So this shows a definite double standard in U.S. society where someone can allege torture on apps with no evidence whatsoever, get a demand of $500 million settlement out of $1 billion they asked for. Meanwhile, the real victims of torture in the United States by the United States government, those both foreign and domestic, receive absolutely none. Thank you for watching. If you like this program, then please head over to my Patreon page and set up a monthly donation. It's your donations that keep this program running. Also, if you would like, please rate, comment, subscribe, and share in various social media.